Okay, so just by way of quickly introducing myself, I'm Joseph Pearce. I'm currently Director of Book Publishing for the Augustine Institute, but I've written a number of books and done some TV on EWTN and what have you, mostly about literary figures. So literature is my thing, so don't be surprised if there's an aspect and an element of the literary in the talk. Obviously, the subject of the talk is the humble shall be exalted, the glory of humility. And this means that we're starting with a paradox. Now, the exaltation of the humble. Well, the humble don't really want to be exalted, right? The whole point about being humble is that exaltation is not that important to you. The whole point about humility is you're not really interested in being glorified. So I want to begin, my path to Christianity was largely paved by G.K. Chesterton. I was actually sitting in a Martin Cothran's talk, and I noticed he quoted Chesterton somewhat. And Chesterton is a master of paradox, and it was through being introduced to Chesterton I began to see the paradoxical nature of reality. So there's going to be a lot of paradox in this talk. And I would say as well, by the way, I'm going to try to finish by about 4:45. So because sometimes the most dynamic part of any session is the Q&A. So that being so, your homework, it won't be on the test because there is no test, but your homework is to try to think of some good questions so we can have a dynamic 15 minutes after I've wrapped up. So, of course, a definition of paradox can be an apparent contradiction that points to a deeper truth. I mean, the metaphysical poets, in metaphysical poetry, it's called a conceit. You put two things together you don't normally think go together, and the unusual juxtaposition forces us to look at it from a new angle. So an apparent contradiction that points to a deeper truth. And surely the paradox of all paradoxes is not one of Chesterton's, but one of Jesus Christ's. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. If you have no imaginative faculty, that is just nonsense. It's a flat contradiction. Of course, the first isn't last and the last isn't first. They contradict each other. If you're first, you're not last. And if you're last, you're not first. Clearly, Jesus Christ is talking nonsense. Now, if you think that, it's because there's something wrong with the way you think. So this talk is going to be largely about the truth of that paradox, the first shall be last, which is axiomatic for any understanding of reality. But there's another, if that's a sort of, if you like, a literary, a play with words paradox, there's also, if you like, a mathematical paradox at the heart of Christianity. And that is that there 3 and 1 and 1 and 3 can actually go together. 3 into 1 does go, if you believe in the Trinity. Now at this point, if you don't mind, because it can be fun, if you forgive me, I'm going to introduce the devil to the conversation. One moment. You Christians, you believe in abject nonsense. Even a 3-year-old knows that 3 doesn't go into 1. They're not synonymous, they're not the same thing. You believe in abject nonsense. Now, I don't know about you, but I can only take the devil in small doses. Hold on for a second. There we go. That's the last time you'll be appearing, you'll be pleased to know. But there's actually, if you like, a devil's advocate at one moment in a great novel by Evelyn Waugh, one of the greatest novels of the 20th century, arguably and perhaps, and I might even argue, the greatest novel of the 20th century, Brideshead Revisited. And in that, the protagonist, the main character, Charles Ryder, he's been having this relationship with a Catholic family, and it's an aristocratic family, and their manor house in the country is called Brideshead. And again, if you read literarily, you're looking for symbols. A Brideshead, what or who is the Brideshead? It's the bridegroom. So Brideshead, this manor house with this family made up of people that are true or untrue to the faith to various degrees, is in some sense a metaphor for the church. But when Charles Ryder turns his back on Brideshead, the house in the countryside, for what he thinks is the last time, he says, I've ceased spending time with such nonsense. In other words, Christianity. He says, henceforth I will believe only in 3 dimensions, perceived with my 5 senses. And I don't know of any more succinct definition of philosophical materialism or atheism than that. Believing in 3 dimensions, perceived with 5 senses, period. That's all there is. Don't look for any truth beyond that. Now, the problem for Charles Ryder, the problem for the atheist, and ultimately indeed the problem for the devil, is that even in physics, even in those 3 dimensions, we are dealing with paradox. And in fact, we're dealing with a paradox which is akin, I would say even a reflection of the Trinity itself. And that's that the very fabric of the material cosmos is a Trinity. What are those 3 dimensions? If you take away one of those 3 dimensions from space, any one of those 3, space collapses and ceases to exist. So space is a Trinity. The unity, the oneness, the wholeness of space consists of 3 dimensions. Now, the other aspect of materialism, it's a bit more complicated for them to try to define what it is materially, but apart from space, of course, there's time. And time, the thing through which space moves, if you like, in some way, is also a Trinity. Because it can only be perceived in terms of past, present, and future. If you take any of those 3 away, time collapses. So the very fabric of the material cosmos consists of 2 trinities, at least as mysterious as the Holy Trinity. These mysterious trinities of physics. But let's now go to metaphysics. The Trinity of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Another paradox, because those 3 can't be separated. The good is always true and beautiful, the true is always good and beautiful, and the beautiful is always good and true. You can't separate them. We distinguish between them from the perspective of trying to understand them, but they are as inseparable as Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And I would even say, I'm not going to talk about it today because there's not time, and I'm not really a theologian either, but I would say that when Christ tells us in the gospel that I am the way, the truth, and the life, he is saying, I am the good, the true, and the beautiful. Because the way of goodness is truth. The way of goodness is love, I should say. The way of reason is truth, and creation and creativity and creator are the beautiful, seeing the life of something as beautiful. Now, so the good, true, and beautiful is a Trinity, but it's more than that. It's a Trinity of Trinities. Because to love, goodness, virtue, is to love. You cannot have love unless you have both a lover and a beloved. And that's not enough. There has to be the act of self-sacrifice on the part of the lover towards the beloved for love to exist. It's a reflection of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. So lover, beloved, and the act of self-sacrifice. A Trinity. The true. The true requires a knower, one who's actually not Noah with the flood, by the way, Noah, K-N-O-W-E-R, one who knows, but there has to be an object for him to know, otherwise there's nothing to know, and there has to be the act of perception and making sense of that perception through the use of reason. So the true is also a Trinity. As for beauty, I'm going to spend a bit more time on beauty, partly because I'm a literature person, and partly because it's often neglected. I'm sure it doesn't actually apply to people that come to the CiRCE conference. But often you think, okay, the good, the true, and the beautiful, well, we obviously have to do the good. We have to be good. We have to be virtuous. The true, yeah, fides et ratio, faith and reason. Obviously, we have to see things rationally. So the good and the true. As for the beautiful, however, that's like a sort of trailer that we'll take with us if we're not in a hurry. But if we are in a hurry, we'll unhitch it and get on a bit faster. Well, I'm going to suggest, by the way, first of all, you'll have gathered if the good, the true, and the beautiful is a Trinity, you can't do that. I'm going to say basically the beauty is the creator, the creature, and the act of creativity. And I'm going to talk here about what the distinction that J.R.R. Tolkien makes between creation and sub-creation. Only God is the creator. We are sub-creators. What's the difference and what's the distinction? God is the creator because he can create ex nihilo. He can make things from nothing. He can bring things into being. We are sub-creators because we can only make things from other things that already exist. So a landscape painter will take his eyes, his hands, his arms, an easel, a canvas, watercolors or oils, the light from the sun, hills, grass, trees, perhaps a building or two, throw a couple of cows in, that's always good. Put all those things together that already exist, and then through the creative gift that you've been given, you make something new, a work of art. Now let's get this important about beauty understood in these terms, because we're made in God's image. And the good, the true, and the beautiful are an indication of in what way we're made in God's image. The good is to love. God is love, and he made us lovers. Love, as a Christian understands it, is not an emotion, it's not a feeling. Insofar as those things are attached to love, it, philosophically speaking, is accidental. We are called to love our enemies, as well as our wives. Sometimes they're the same person. Not in my case, I hasten to add, at least not often. But the point is, obviously, you're not going to have the same feelings towards your wife or your children as you're going to have towards your enemy. But we're called to love all of them. So it's not about emotions and feelings, which are an accidental aspect. Love is a rational choice. Love is, if goodness is part of the Trinity, it's rational. Love is freely and rationally choosing to lay down your life for the beloved. It's a rational choice. That's what Christ does for us. He rationally chooses to suffer for us. We are called to be Christ-like by doing the same thing. The true, again, we have been given the gift of reason. We don't just experience things like perhaps a caterpillar might, got a caterpillar in my mind because Martin Cothran's reference to Bertie Wooster, to Jeeves calling Bertie Wooster's moustache a caterpillar in the last talk. But obviously we don't reason. Well, so a caterpillar doesn't reason. We can reason not just by looking at something and making sense of it, we can reason abstractly. We can come to sort of concepts such as the square root of -1, and we can come to things such as electronics in consequence. We can not just experience light, we can know it comes from the sun, and we can work out how far the sun is away from us. We can work out how long it takes light to get from the sun to us. God is logos, ratio, reason. We're made in his image. We can come to the truth through the use of reason. But God is also the creator. So creator in Latin, poiesis. In Greek, from which we get the word poet. God is the poet. His creation is the poem. This is why, for instance, in Tolkien, the creation of Middle-earth, the one God declares to the angelic beings the great music. Here, God is the great composer of the music of creation. C.S. Lewis has Aslan sing Narnia into being. So God is the great artist, the great composer, the great poet, the creator. Therefore, also, we are creators. We are meant to create. We are meant to be creative. We're meant to be bringing beautiful things into being, albeit from other things that already exist. And Tolkien talks about what I call a hierarchy of creative value. At the top is the creator. Below that is creation. Those things made directly by God. And then below that is what Tolkien calls subcreation. And he subdivides subcreation into two parts. What we might call, at least as it should be, subcreation to the glory of God. Giving back to the giver of the gift the fruits of the gift given. And then also subcreation for the use of man, what we might call technology. I was giving a talk once in Portugal, in Lisbon in Portugal. I can't remember what the topic of the talk was, but this subject of hierarchy of creative value came up, and I went through creator at the top, creation, subcreation, to the glory of God, art, subcreation for the use of man, technology, and then people started sniggering and laughing and whispering to each other. Now, the two things you don't want to happen if you're giving a talk. The first is you tell a joke and nobody laughs. It's not a good position to be in, somewhat embarrassing. But the next worst to that is not telling a joke and everybody laughs. I thought, well, what did I say that was funny? I wasn't aware that I was making a joke. So one of them put his hand up and said, well, you just said that, creator, creation, subcreation, the glory of God, art, subcreation for the use of man, technology. He said, this is an engineering school. So I'd actually consign them all to the bottom of the heap. But I did point out, this is a hierarchy of goods. It's not that the things at the bottom of the list are not important or good. On the contrary, I said, thanks be to God, I'm looking out and you're all wearing clothes. Thanks be to God, there's a roof over our heads. I can't remember what time of year it was, but thanks be to God, there's either heating or air conditioning. So these are all good, but there's an appropriate hierarchy here. Now, however, and this to sound a little bit controversial, I don't like giving a talk without being controversial at least once. there is a way in which we can actually improve upon God's creation. And does that sound blasphemous? And just remember, yesterday was the feast of St. Mary Magdalene. He who without sin cast the first stone at me. Right? Let me explain how we can improve upon God's creation. I'll explain by telling a story. Once upon a time, there was a rock. And it was actually a very beautiful rock. But it was a secret rock, because nobody had ever seen it. But then one day, using the gifts of subcreation for the use of man, i.e. technology, someone came along and dug the rock up. He'd been there for millions of years unseen. And now people could see it. And some people noticed it, some people thought it was beautiful. But then somebody came along and said, that's not a beautiful rock. That's the beautiful rock. And that person took that rock and did things with it. Now, if you ever find yourself in Rome and you go into St. Peter's Basilica and you look to the right as you go in, you will see a little side chapel there with Michelangelo's Pieta, with the crucified dead Christ laying in the lap of his mother. That's what Michelangelo did to that rock. Now, of course, he could only do that because of the gifts that God had given him, and he was doing exactly what God wanted him to do with the gifts that were given him. He's giving back to the giver of the gifts the glory of the fruit given. Okay, so I hope you can see in this paradox, we have paradox after paradox after paradox here. First shall be last, last shall be first. The Holy Trinity, the ubiquitous Trinity of space, the ubiquitous Trinity of time, the Trinity, metaphysical, transcendental Trinity of the good, the true, and the beautiful, how each of those is itself a Trinity. Beauty, creator, creativity, producing a creature, or a sub-creature if you prefer for art. All right, so where does the first shall be last come into all of this? In fact, how do we even perceive all of this that we've been talking about? And it goes down to one of the labels we've given ourselves over the years for who we are. The one we've given ourselves most recently is the most stupid, Homo sapiens. This is only 200 years old. First known use of it was the early 19th century. And of course, it's an absurd label for us because Homo sapiens means wise man. And if you look at human history from the beginning of time, one characteristic that does not spring to mind as being something which is true of all of us is wisdom. In actual fact, we make the same mistakes in every generation because we refuse to learn the mistakes that previous generations have made. Wisdom is not an adequate label for us. Nor is an even more recent one, Homo economicus. But we won't even bother to talk about that. Except maybe Oscar Wilde's quip that a cynic is someone who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. Homo economicus. No, an older label for us, the Greek label anthropos, where we get anthropology. Now, they're etymologists, philologists, experts in the history of languages and the roots of words will argue about the original meaning of the word anthropos, and I'm just merely going to quote an authority which I think is adequate. According to Plato, anthropos means he who turns upwards. In other words, what distinguishes us from all the other creatures is that they are enslaved by instinct. I sometimes put it by saying, the animal grazes, but man gazes. We look up, we ask questions, and the key word, we wonder. Anthropos is one who wonders. And where does the gift of wonder come from? Well, let's turn to Another great philosopher, Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas says that there's, if you like, a five-fold path of perception. To understand reality in its fullness requires 5 stages. It begins with virtue, and specifically the virtue of humility. In other words, if you want to perceive reality in its deepest depths, you have to be one of those who believes that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Because, says Aquinas, the fruit of humility is gratitude. And it's only if we have gratitude that we are enkindled to wonder. It's only if we have gratitude that our eyes are opened in wonder. And it's only if our eyes are opened in wonder that we are moved to contemplation. And it's only if we move to contemplation that we experience dilatatio, dilation, the opening of the mind and soul into the fullness of reality. So humility, gratitude, wonder, contemplation, dilation. So humility is essential to an understanding, an engagement with reality on anything but the most superficial level. And I would say here, second point of controversy, that this means that humility is the greatest of all the virtues. Now, some people are sniggering because you know you're St. Paul. Right? The greatest of the virtues, of course, is charity, is love. So how can I possibly say that humility is the greatest of the virtues and contradict St. Paul? Just to add to the controversy, by the way, before you do throw stones at me for being a heretic, St. Paul says, that when I was a child, I put away childish things. But now I'm a grown man. So when I was a child, I did childish things. Now I'm a man, I put away childish things. Jesus Christ says, unless you become like a little child, you don't enter the kingdom of heaven. Now clearly, it's a bit of the devil's advocate now. Maybe he crept back in when I wasn't looking. Obviously, when St. Paul talks about being childish, he doesn't mean the same thing that Christ does when he talks about being childlike. They're talking about two different things. In actual fact, we can only actually become childlike as adults by ceasing to be childish. You can see, for instance, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings as stories about growing up and becoming like little children. So Bilbo Baggins is childish at the beginning of the story, and through the acceptance of suffering and laying down his life for others, he becomes childlike at the end of it. The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde is a story about someone who remains childish, ultimately to the cost of his soul. The parable of the prodigal son is about both childishness and childlikeness. The prodigal son begins as being childish and comes back like a child to his father. So anyway, let's get back to the other problem. What's the greatest of the virtues? First of all, what's the first and the worst of the sins? Pride. What's the perfect definition of pride? Bearing in mind that God does not create evil things, so therefore anything which is evil is the absence of a good. It's a privation. So the perfect definition of pride is the absence of humility. So what about love? It's impossible to love unless you have humility. So the two go hand in hand. In other words, it's a moot point. Because to love is to freely choose to put yourself last. First shall be last, and the last shall be first. That's the paradox of love. To put yourself last instead of first requires humility. The act of love requires humility. The presence of pride destroys love. So let's look at, so we had a quietness now. Humility, gratitude, wonder, contemplation, dilatatio. Now let's look at the other great philosopher, probably the equal of Plato and Thomas Aquinas, Jane Austen. In Pride and Prejudice, she actually encapsulates this Thomistic understanding of the perception of reality. Because pride always precedes prejudice. In fact, pride causes prejudice because pride prevents us from seeing things as they are because we're seeing them as we want them to be, which is not the same thing. So let's look at it. Humility. If pride is the absence of humility, so instead of starting with humility, we begin with pride. If we have pride, we will have no sense of gratitude. If we have no sense of gratitude, we'll have no sense of wonder. If we have no sense of wonder, we will not be moved to contemplation. And if we're not moved to contemplation, instead of having the dilation, the opening of the mind and soul into the fullness of reality, we'll have the shriveling and shrinking of it into a pathetic, shrunken remnant of what the soul was meant to be. You want psychological realism? Look at Gollum. And I think we should be using a new verb, by the way, amongst ourselves. You keep doing that, you're going to Gollumize yourself. All right, so we've seen here, I hope, how this apparently contradictory paradox, the first shall be last, the last shall be first, is at the very heart of reality. You have to believe that the first shall be last and the last shall be first to actually believe anything else. Because if we don't believe that, we will have pride. If we have pride, we will not be able to go any deeper. Now, we've looked at aspects of what makes us in the image of God here. We've looked at the fact that we're lovers, the good, the fact that we are reasoners, the true, and the fact that we are creators or sub-creators, the beautiful, creativity. But there's another aspect of the divine image in us which we all too often overlook, and that is humour. Because one way that you can find out why we're made in the image of God in a unique way, in other words, in a way that's distinct from the rest of creation, because if you look out the window, we can't do that from here now, but you see a tree is made in the image of God because it's God's imagination that brought the tree into being. So if you like, all of his creatures are made in his image, but we're made in his image in a level which is divine and not merely creaturely. That's why we love, we reason, we create. But we also laugh. No other animal laughs. Hyenas sound as if they do, but they're faking it. And to get a little bit controversial again here, I think it's the end of orthodoxy, which also I noticed Martin Cothran mentioned in his talk. I think it's at the end of orthodoxy. It's only the end of one of Chesterton's books, and I think it's not orthodoxy, it's the everlasting man, but I think it's orthodoxy. When Chesterton says, I think that the one thing that God has never revealed to us, and the reason he turned his back on us, was to hide the fact he was laughing. Now, I sometimes, just to spice that up and make it more controversial, say that the reason that God turned his back on Adam and Eve was to hide the fact that he was laughing. Now, at this point, hang on for a second. Original sin's no laughing matter, right? We've been living with it since the beginning of time. Christ was crucified because of it. It's no laughing matter. Let me say one thing, however. I also would say, by the way, that God didn't turn his back on Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve turned their back on God. But once they had turned their back on him, then he laughed. I've currently, we have 2 children with us. We've lost some. But we have a 19-year-old son who has Down syndrome and autism, but we have a 13-year-old daughter. Our 19-year-old son is still cute because he's who he is. My 13-year-old daughter's not as cute as she was 10 years ago. And I'm glad she's not here to hear that. And I should keep away from any recordings. When she was 3, she was very cute. But she was also naughty. And, occasionally when she's naughty, I've chastised her with a stern look on my face so she knows that I'm being serious here. So a lesson needs to be learned here. And then I have to turn away because I can't stop myself from smiling, which would ruin the whole effect. Now, I'm a miserable sinner. How much more does God love us than I love my daughter? Also, how much less is God threatened by naughtiness than I am? Because we talked about time being a trinity, past, present, and future. That is absolutely the only way it can be experienced by mere mortals such as us. But it's not the way it's experienced by God. For God, there's no past and there's no future. When we talk about God's omnipresence, which is, of course, inseparable from his omniscience, you want to look at another trinity: omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence. We are with God's omnipresence, we think about, well, God's present everywhere. Right? He's on my head, he's under the podium, he's hiding behind that lady at the back there, probably laughing. But that's not the deeper meaning of omnipresence. The deeper meaning is not that God's present everywhere, but that everything is present to God. So when Adam and Eve originally sin, God knows his crucifixion. God knows his crucifixion before he made Adam from clay. He knows his resurrection. He knows the redemption. He knows the price that he pays. Again, not will pay. Now, we can't get our head around that because we are mere mortals, so we can only experience time in terms of past, present, and future. So if you only understand it that way, God was never shocked and horrified and angry like I might be when our first parents chose not to love. And that's what sin is. It's choosing not to love. When God made us in his image as lovers, he had to give us freedom. And Tolkien says that one of the key ingredients of the greatest stories is the mystical sense of prohibition. The way he puts it, the locked door stands as an eternal temptation. So the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Pandora's box, etc. The locked door stands as an eternal temptation, but what God doesn't do is say, the door's locked, don't open it. He does say that, and I've hidden the key. He doesn't do that. He says, the door's locked, it needs to stay locked. Here's the key. You're free to open it. But you shouldn't, and there'll be a price to pay if you do. That's love. But you can't love unless you freely choose to sacrifice yourself for another person. If you're not free to choose, you can't love. You're a slave. So God knows when he makes us lovers that we will choose poorly. And he loves us enough to choose that anyway. Okay, so let's look at humour now to finish up with. Humour can be abused, like creative gifts can be abused. We all know examples of bad humour. We all know examples of bad art. We all know examples of bad lives being lived. God doesn't take away the gift of life the moment that we abuse it. If he did, I'd be the only person in the room now. Thanks be to God, right? It doesn't remove a gift the first time we abuse it. Humour, good humour, is always connected to humility. Humour and humility. The only person who cannot be humiliated is one with humility. Because humiliation is the hurting of our pride. And it's painful. It hurts. We feel humiliated. I'll give some examples from Chesterton. Chesterton's humour, just to finish up. Chesterton was a big man. You know, I try to do everything like Chesterton. I'm working on it. But there's some wonderful examples of what I call Chesterton's mirth about his girth. He came to the United States twice, both during Prohibition. That gave him lots of good reason to philosophize and to seek the Spirit. But while he was in the United States, as an example, he was trying to get into a cab, and the American cab drivers tried to help him in and trying to sort of, perhaps, if you try to get in sideways. And Chesterton says, I have no sideways. And my favourite was during World War I, he's on a bus in London, and this woman comes up to him and basically calls him a coward, the white feather scenario. Calls him a coward and says, Sir, why are you not out at the front? And Chesterton says, Madam, if you go round to my side, you will see that I am. Which is actually the perfect response. Now, it's preposterous to think that Chesterton, who by this time anyway was 40-plus years old, but clearly out of shape, that he almost died in 1914 of serious illness. I had this image of Chesterton in a uniform, and again, even thinking of making the uniform big enough to fit him, and then them having to, it's time to go over the top into no man's land in the trenches, and they have to winch him out, right, to get him out of the trench, and then he waddles across no man's land, the biggest target imaginable. Now, clearly, his mirth there was the perfect riposte, but done with charity. And one of the lessons I've learned from Chesterton, I try to live by this. He said of his relationship with his brother, we were always arguing, but we never quarrelled. Now, basically, an argument is two people disagreeing about something with the objective of getting to know the truth better. And even if at the end of it you both disagree, at least you know the other person's position better. That in itself is good. A quarrel is an argument in the absence of charity. I'm going to just finish up now by giving you an example of Chesterton's wit and wisdom, his humour, but also his deep philosophy. And this is really, in some ways, what we've just been talking about. First shall be last, last shall be first, pride versus humility. Let me explain this. This is a miracle, really. There was a relativist living in the early 20th century called Holbrook Jackson. And he wrote a book called Platitudes in the Making, just little aphorisms. Chesterton obviously had a copy of this book and had written his replies in his own handwriting in the book. Now, by some miracle, and I call it that, this book, Chesterton's own copy of this book, found itself in a used bookstore in San Francisco, right next door to the offices of Ignatius Press, which is the largest Catholic publisher in this country. So they actually published a facsimile of Chesterton's replies to these. This is from this. So what I'm going to do, when I'm being Holbrook Jackson, I'm just going to speak as I am. When I'm Chesterton, I'm going to put on the hat, okay? Right? It's a Basque beret. It's not an appropriate hat, but the Chestertonian hat was too big for the case. So it will do. So let's have some fun to finish off with. Be contented when you have got all you want. Till then, be happy. Don't think, do. Do think, do. A lie is that which you do not believe. This is a lie, so perhaps you don't believe it. As soon as an idea is accepted, it is time to reject it. No, it is time to build another idea on it. You are always rejecting and you build nothing. Truth and falsehood in the abstract do not exist. Then nothing else does. Truth is one's own conception of things. The big blunder. All thought is an attempt to discover if one's own conception is true or not. No two men have exactly the same religion. A church, like society, is a compromise. The same religion has the two men. The sun shines on the evil and the good, but the sun does not compromise. And this one I think is my favourite. Only the rich preach content to the poor when they're not preaching socialism. In a beautiful city, an art gallery would be superfluous. In an ugly one, it is a narcotic. In a real one, it is an art gallery. Negations without affirmations are worthless and impossible. Theology and religion are not the same thing. When the churches are controlled by the theologians, religious people stay away. Theology is simply that part of religion that requires brains. We are more inclined to regret our virtues than our vices, but only the very honest would admit this. I don't regret any virtues except those I have lost. This is a good one too. Every custom was once an eccentricity. Every idea was once an absurdity. No, no, no. Some ideas are always absurdities. This is one of them. No opinions matter, finally, except your own, said the man who thought he was a rabbit. Take my Chesterton hat off now. So I hope this encapsulates one of my favourite Chestertonian paradoxes to finish up here. When he said, angels can fly because they take themselves lightly, and that the devil fell by the force of his own gravity. The proud take themselves much too seriously. Those who put themselves first will be last. Those who put themselves last will be first. The humble shall be exalted. This is the glory of humility. Thank you. And we have 10 minutes. Yes?
What was that book that he was commenting?
The book that was published with his responses in was published as Platitudes Undone. Yes?
Where can you find that last line you just said?
What, the man who thought he was a rabbit?
No, the one about the angel
Oh.
light.
Oh, yeah, you put me on the spot. Right, on the internet. Hopefully it will give you sources as well. I've forgotten. I mean, Chesterton wrote so much. It could be in one of his essays. It could be in something like Orthodoxy. But to be honest with you, I'll quote Chesterton all the time from memory, and I don't have all the footnotes with me when I do so. So forgive me. And by the way, the angels can fly because they take themselves lightly, and the devil falls by the force of his own gravity, are not actually connected. They're two separate thoughts I just juxtapose, as you're forcing me to be scholarly at this point. Any other questions? Huh? Yes?
Do the words humor and humility have the same root?
I don't think so. It's a play on words. Yes?
So, beyond praying, as we're working with children and coming alongside children, what are good questions or stories or ways to direct our children to humility rather than and not shame?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that we need to, an absolutely crucial lesson we need to teach our children today is what is love? For instance, I read a book called Shakespeare on Love, Seeing the Hidden Meaning in Romeo and Juliet, because Shakespeare wrote that play as a cautionary tale about the danger of following passion irrationally. So the modern world thinks that love's and emotion is about feeling good. If you make someone feel good and they make you feel good, you're in love. When it doesn't feel good anymore, you're no longer in love. And that, of course, is actually a diabolical inversion of a Christian understanding of love, which is voluntarily laying down your life for the other person. So I think if you really want your children to understand humility, you've got to start with making them understand what love is, because love requires humility. As I said, if you put yourself first, you're never going to be able to love. And the other thing as well, that the most miserable people in the world are those who put themselves first. There's another paradox. Any other questions? Well, I'm glad I didn't leave 20 minutes for the Q&A. That's all I can say. It's 5 to 5. Well, thanks so much, everybody. See you at the banquet. God bless.